You have $2 million saved. You've run the 4% rule. You know you can spend $80,000 a year. But last year you spent $47,000, and you felt guilty about that. That gap, $33,000 of money you were allowed to spend but didn't, is what I want to talk about today. Because that number is not random. Researchers who study retirement spending have a name for it: the retirement consumption gap. And for households with $2 million to $5 million saved, that gap averages $20,000 to $30,000 every single year. Over 20 years, that's $400,000 to $600,000 of wealth you built, protected, and then never used. Now here's the part that surprises most people. The gap doesn't shrink as your portfolio gets bigger. It actually gets wider. The $5 million retiree often spends less relative to what they could safely withdraw than the person who retired with $1 million. The size of the number changes. The psychology that blocks you from spending it gets harder to overcome. So when people ask me, what actually changes between $1 million, $2 million, and $5 million in retirement? The honest answer is not the withdrawal rate. The honest answer is the psychological and tax barriers that shift at each level. And unless you have a system to handle those barriers, a bigger portfolio doesn't automatically mean a better retirement. If you're a saver who wants to become a smart spender without blowing up your plan, subscribe right now. I'm going to show you the exact formula. Let me start with the number that explains everything. Here's the concrete number that should frame everything else in this video. A $2 million portfolio using the 4% rule gives you $80,000 pre-tax per year. But according to J.P. Morgan's 2025 retirement spending study, households with $2 million to $5 million actually spend an average of $62,000 per year. That's an $18,000 gap every single year. Over 20 years, that's $360,000 of income you were allowed to take, but left sitting in an account instead. And that gap gets wider as the portfolio gets larger, not smaller, wider. So why is that happening? Because the barrier isn't math. The math is fine. The barrier changes depending on how much you saved, and each level has its own specific trap. If you retired with $1 million, the fear of running out is real and it's rational. A 4% withdrawal is $40,000 a year. Add Social Security, let's say $25,000, and you're at $65,000 total. Every dollar you spend feels like a dollar you won't have in year 17 or year 22. The trap at this level is scarcity mindset. Every purchase triggers a quiet calculation. Can I afford to do this and still be okay? That feeling doesn't go away just because your financial advisor told you the math works. If you retired with $2 million, the math actually does work. You can pull $80,000, add Social Security, and land somewhere around $110,000 a year. That's a comfortable income for most households. But here's the trap. You've been a disciplined saver for 35 years. You maxed your 401k. You drove the same car for 11 years. You chose the cheaper hotel on vacation. Spending that money now doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like breaking the rules you lived by. Spending feels like failure. If you retired with $5 million, the math is generous, but the trap is the tax code. Required minimum distributions, Medicare surcharges, and state tax brackets create a fog that makes it nearly impossible to know what you can actually keep after taxes. So you freeze. You spend less not because you're afraid of running out, but because you genuinely don't know what's safe to touch without triggering a tax event. 3 different portfolio sizes. 3 completely different psychological barriers. The dollar amount is not the problem. The system you use to manage it is. This isn't about you being cheap or irrational. The same discipline that built your wealth is now working against you. Your saving instinct is a superpower that has outlived its original mission. And the honest question isn't, why can't I bring myself to spend? The honest question is, what system can I put in place so that spending becomes automatic and guilt-free? That's exactly what the next section covers. I used to think the answer to this problem was just more discipline around spending. I'd tell clients to build a fun budget and give themselves permission to use it. It almost never worked. What I eventually figured out is that these people weren't undisciplined. They were the most disciplined people I'd ever worked with. And that was exactly the problem. Telling someone with 35 years of iron financial self-control to just be okay with spending more is like telling a long-distance runner to walk slower. The instinct fights it. So instead of fighting the instinct, I started looking for a rule that could work with it. The mechanical spending rule works like this. On the day you retire, write down your portfolio balance. That is your baseline number. Every January, check your current balance. If your portfolio has grown by 20% or more above that starting number, you don't get to decide whether or not to spend more. The rule decides for you. You calculate the dollar amount of that growth. Then you take 10% of it and add it to your discretionary spending budget for the year. Travel, experiences, gifts, whatever matters to you. Here's what that looks like with real numbers. You retire with $2 million. After 2 good years in the market, your portfolio has grown to $2,400,000, a 20% gain above your starting balance. The growth is $400,000. 10% of that is $40,000. That $40,000 goes into your spending budget for the year. You don't have to feel guilty about it because you didn't decide to spend it. The rule did. Why does a rule work when a budget doesn't? Because a rule removes the emotional decision entirely. You're not choosing to spend. You're executing a system. And for someone who spent decades executing a saving system, that reframe is everything. You're still being disciplined. You're just disciplined to a different rule now. The math also holds up under pressure. A $2 million portfolio earning 7% per year, withdrawing 4% annually, and following this rule in years when the portfolio clears the 20% threshold, that portfolio still has a better than 90% probability of lasting 30 years based on long-run Monte Carlo simulation data. You're not spending recklessly. You're spending at a level the portfolio already proved it could support. But here's the catch. This rule only works cleanly if your portfolio is structured the right way. Because if your $5 million is sitting entirely in a traditional IRA, triggering extra spending doesn't just cost you money. It can trigger a tax bill that wipes out a significant portion of what you were trying to enjoy. That's where the real difference between $1 million, $2 million, and $5 million shows up. If you've spent 35 years maxing out your 401k, driving a 10-year-old car, and saying no to things your coworkers were saying yes to, of course spending feels wrong. That's not a character flaw. That's a skill. It's the skill that got you here. But the game has changed, and the same instinct that was a superpower in accumulation mode is quietly working against you in distribution mode. The behavioral research on this is pretty consistent. When people experience a spending decision, the brain processes it in the same region that processes physical pain. Paying for something triggers a low-level discomfort response, even when you have plenty of money to cover it. Now, layer 35 years of train-saving behavior on top of that. Every purchase gets filtered through a habit loop your brain built over decades. You don't consciously decide spending feels wrong. It just does. The identity piece makes it worse. Most people who saved seriously over their career built a self-image around being responsible with money. They're a saver. That's who they are. When spending threatens to undo that identity, even partially, even rationally, the brain resists. It's not stubbornness, it's self-protection. I remember sitting with a client, I'll call him Mark. He had $3,200,000 saved. He and his wife wanted to go to Italy for their 40th anniversary. The trip would cost $12,000. Mark spent 3 months agonizing over it. He showed me spreadsheets. He ran scenarios where the trip somehow ended in financial ruin by age 90. I finally said, "Mark, your portfolio went up $180,000 last year. You're telling me you can't spend 6% of that on a memory?" He booked the trip the next day. The mechanical spending rule works on exactly this problem. Instead of asking yourself, "Should I spend this?" a question your saving instinct will always answer with some version of maybe not. You replace the decision with an execution. The portfolio grew. The rule says 10% of that growth goes to something you love. You're not breaking your system. You're following a different part of it. Think of it this way. Instead of thinking, "I'm spending my money," you're thinking, "I'm paying myself a performance bonus." The portfolio grew because you made good decisions over a long time. Taking 10% of that growth and putting it toward something meaningful is not waste. It's collecting a dividend on being a responsible investor. The psychology only runs half the problem, though. The other half is the tax code, and it hits $5 million portfolios in ways that most people never see coming. Here's the long-run picture. And this part matters, so stay with me. If you retire at 65 with $2 million and you never change your behavior, you keep your spending at $62,000 a year while your portfolio safely supports $80,000. Here's what the math shows after 20 years. Assuming 7% average annual returns and 4% withdrawals, your portfolio at age 85 would be roughly $2,800,000 in inflation-adjusted terms. You held it together. You didn't run out. You also didn't spend the growth. Now run the other scenario. Same portfolio, same return assumptions. But in the years when the portfolio clears the 20% growth threshold, you follow the mechanical rule and spend 10% of that growth on something meaningful. Some years that adds $30,000 to your budget. Some years it adds $50,000. Over the same 20 years, your portfolio at age 85 lands around $2,500,000 in inflation-adjusted terms. The difference is about $300,000 less for your heirs and $400,000 more spent on your actual life. Now consider what those 20 years look like. Ages 65 to 75 are what retirement researchers call the go-go years. That's when you still have the health, the energy, and the physical capacity to travel, to take on projects, to be active. After 75, spending naturally slows not because the money runs out, but because the body does. The $300,000 that stays in the portfolio in the no-rule scenario doesn't improve your retirement. It improves your estate. That's a personal decision. Some people genuinely want to leave a larger inheritance, and that's a completely legitimate goal. But a lot of people I talk to think they're being financially responsible, when they're really just deferring spending to an age when they may not be able to enjoy it. The trade-off is this: less money for the estate, more life for the living. The mechanical rule doesn't make that choice for you. It just makes sure you're making it consciously, rather than by default. But before you can use any of this, you need to see how the tax code can quietly rewrite your plan, especially if your number is close to $5 million. Let's stress test the $5 million scenario, because this is where people get blindsided. You have $5 million sitting in a traditional IRA. You retire at 65, live comfortably on $120,000 a year, and you feel good about the situation. Then you turn 73, and the IRS starts requiring you to take money out whether you need it or not. This is the required minimum distribution, the RMD. At age 73, the IRS Uniform Lifetime Table uses a divisor of 26.5. On a $5 million account, that means your required withdrawal is approximately $189,000 for the year. But you only need $120,000. The extra $69,000 is forced income, and every dollar of it gets taxed at your marginal rate. Here's where it compounds. That extra $69,000 pushes your total income above the IRMAA threshold. For a single filer in 2026, once your income crosses $106,000, Medicare starts charging you a surcharge on your Part B and Part D premiums. Depending on how far above that threshold your income lands, those surcharges can add $3,000 to $5,000 per year to your Medicare costs, on top of the income tax you're already paying on the forced distribution. So you're now paying extra tax on money you didn't want to take out, plus higher Medicare premiums triggered by income you didn't need. That is the tax torpedo. And it's not a planning mistake. It's a structural problem that comes from putting all your assets in tax-deferred accounts without a plan for what happens at 73. The people who avoid this trap did their Roth conversions during the gap years, the years between when they retired and when RMDs kicked in. They used that window to shift money from traditional IRA accounts into Roth accounts at controlled tax rates. They also built a taxable brokerage account for flexible spending, so they could pull from after-tax money when they needed it, without triggering a cascade of additional income. If you're in your late 50s or early 60s right now, that window is open. Once RMDs start, it closes. So the system works at every portfolio level, but the way you implement it changes depending on where your money sits. So how do you actually put this into practice? Here are the 4 steps. Step 1. Establish your baseline. On the day you retire, or right now if you're already retired, write down your total portfolio value. This is your starting number. Everything flows from this single reference point. Don't overthink it. Don't use an average. Use the actual balance on a specific date. Step 2. Run a January check every year. On January 1st, or whenever you typically review your finances at the start of the year, compare your current balance to that starting number. If your portfolio has grown by 20% or more above baseline, the rule activates. Calculate the dollar growth, take 10% of it, and that amount becomes your discretionary spending budget for the year. Travel, experiences, giving to your kids or grandkids, home projects, whatever matters to you personally. Step 3. Make it automatic. Open a dedicated spending account. A high-yield savings account works fine. And set up a monthly transfer from your brokerage for the appropriate amount. Divide your annual spending budget by 12 and move that amount every month. This removes another decision point. You don't have to think about whether to transfer funds. It happens. The goal is to spend this money by the end of the year. If you don't, consider donating the remainder to something you care about. The point is to break the habit of rolling unspent money back into savings. Step 4. Install guardrails for down years. This is the part most people skip, but it's what makes the whole system credible. If your portfolio drops 20% below its recent peak, you reduce discretionary spending by 10% for that year. You don't eliminate it, you trim it. This is adapted from the Guyton-Klinger guardrail framework, which uses portfolio performance to adjust withdrawal rates automatically. These 4 steps create a closed loop. Portfolio grows, you spend more. Portfolio drops, you pull back slightly. The decision is never emotional, it's mechanical. I had a client who followed a version of this approach for 3 years. His portfolio grew from $2,100,000 to $2,700,000 over that period. The rule generated $60,000 in additional spending budget across those years. He took his whole family to Alaska. He told me it was the best year of his life. His portfolio today sits at $2,500,000, still well above his starting balance, still growing. If you want to stop second-guessing every purchase and start actually using what you built, subscribe. I release a new framework every week for people who saved seriously and now want to spend strategically. Let me bring this together. The real difference between $1 million, $2 million, and $5 million in retirement is not the withdrawal rate. The math at each level is manageable. The difference is the psychological and tax barriers that become harder to navigate as the number gets bigger. At $1 million, the barrier is fear of running out. At $2 million, the barrier is the identity of a lifelong saver who doesn't know how to switch modes. At $5 million, the barrier is a tax structure that creates forced income, Medicare surcharges, and spending paralysis all at once. The mechanical spending rule addresses all 3. It removes the emotional decision. It turns permission into a formula, and it builds guardrails so that you only increase spending when the portfolio has already proven it can handle it. I can't tell you exactly how this plays out in your situation. Every plan is different, but the core principle holds. You didn't build this over 30 years to leave it untouched. The goal of retirement is not to die with the biggest balance. It's to die with the best stories. This rule gives you a way to write those stories without taking your eye off the plan. If this changed how you're thinking about your retirement spending, hit like and subscribe. And if you have a specific portfolio size you want me to break down in detail, drop it in the comments. I read everyone,